Hello everyone, welcome to the History Valley YouTube channel of your host, Jacob Ehrman. Today I am joined by John K. Winford, and I'm going to give a brief introduction, and then we'll go from there. So John K. Winford took a free class online at Harvard on an edX on Paul and early Christianity. He also worked with Ehrman and Candida Moss, and his mentor was Peter Kirby. He is a historicist. He accepts the consensus view that there was a historical Jesus, among other things relating to the consensus in early Christianity and studies regarding it. And today we're going to be discussing that, and we're also going to be discussing Paul and why there is a historical Jesus to be found in Paul's epistles. So without further ado, let's get started. So John, what is your viewpoint on Paul, and in regards to how Paul's authentic epistles supports a historical Jesus?
Well, Paul wasn't selling anything but what his community believed in. And what they were selling, they weren't trying to prove anything, and they were just basically arguing theology and Christology with other communities and ways to practice and follow this new faith. So with Paul, it gets to be complicated because I look at it as his work. His 7 epistles are basically a community work. They had a scribe dictating it. It was a room full of people. Paul was part of it. And I mean, to me, the context of his epistles have nothing to do with the celestial Jesus in any way. It's a Jesus who died, went to heaven, and sits with God. And that's what he came into the picture late, but he definitely describes a Jesus that lived and died, regardless of a celestial Jesus or not.
Yeah, I also have similar views. Paul, he seems to describe a man as being a Christ incarnate. In Philippians, he says Jesus became a man, and in Galatians, he says something about him being born of a woman. I know that Mythicists try to say that the way Paul describes it is so vague, and I know that Dr. Carrier says something about David and some celestial sperm bank, and I don't really understand where he's going with that, because I mean, I don't even, as far as I'm aware of, there's not one example in Jewish angelology of an angel that is a son of David in outer space. The whole celestial Jesus was Earl Doherty's right.
Concept. And Carrier adopted that and tried to evolve it forward, and it was a failing idea to begin with. And we poked holes in it, debating with Earl personally. I had pointed out things, and he couldn't refute it, and was basically done at that point. This was before he even published his book to begin with. And to me, it was just not an intelligent path to go down, because they're cherry picking. To me, the same way that creationists do, and they're ignoring a lot of important details, and they're changing the context. So when the Pauline scribes were writing what Paul and their group wanted them to write, they went out of their way to sell what they're selling. They over-exaggerated. Their job was to persuade the reader that this was the right theology, that Paul was a man of God and he was chosen by Jesus, and this is exactly, what you should be practicing. And in no way are they selling a celestial type deity,
Right.
in any way. I mean, they make it pretty dang clear. And if you just read the letters, read them one by one, you don't get what they're talking about, because they're not selling that in any way. I mean, there's certain verses that they're almost relying on the absence of evidence is almost their strong point, which is pretty weak to begin with. But it's just the whole out of context thing drives me nuts for what they were trying to sell. And I don't think they pulled it off. I think they failed miserably, and I think Carrier knew it was a bad idea, and I think my own personal belief, it was a cash grab, just for him. He knew that his audience were uneducated atheists, and it pisses me off as an atheist that he's preying on their ignorance. So that's sort of my problem with his whole hypothesis and what he posits.
I see. Yeah, the thing is, as I discussed before, like there are times in Paul where he seems to, I think the closest I can get to there being a celestial Jesus, so-called celestial Jesus, in the epistles is the times when
Your
Paul.
voice is breaking up.
Okay, can you still hear me?
Yep, now I can.
Yeah, for a split
It came
second.
back. So your video came back. It
Yeah.
disappeared for a second.
Yeah, for a split second, you did disappear from on my end as well. But I was gonna say, I think the closest thing I can get to it.
Lost you again.
Yeah, same here, but you're back again. Let me see real quick. All right. Hopefully it'll stay where it is now. Hopefully everything will stay connected.
There
Okay.
we go.
So the closest I was gonna say the closest thing that I can get to there being a celestial Jesus, the closest I can get to it, is that Paul, like I've discussed before, seems to be tap dancing a little bit around what he means by crucifixion. I don't deny that at all, that there was a historical crucifixion of Jesus. That's not the point. He seems to be a little bit weird about it. Like in 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Paul has Jesus being crucified by the rulers of the age, but he won't come out and say it. But it was Romans. But in 1 Thessalonians 2:13-16, Jesus is executed on earth, but he doesn't mention a crucifixion there, and that's odd.
That's all easily explainable to me in my sense of what's going on, because of his conflict with the supposed Jerusalem church,
Right.
with James and Peter. They knew him, and he's joined these Hellenists in the diaspora that were already practicing. And so he joins these people. It's Hellenistic Judaism. He was far removed from the historical Jesus, and he wants to be a follower of Jesus. He wants to be an apostle more than anything. You can see it. I mean, he's just trying to prove to these communities that he's arguing with that he is a legitimate apostle.
Right.
And so he's avoiding any historical connection, because the James and Peter had all that down pat. And if he said anything, it would be used as polemic against him.
Yeah, because in Galatians chapter 3, he talks about, oh, you foolish Galatians, who have bewitched you, and that's something else about Jesus was portrayed as crucified at Jerusalem, and yet you reject his crucifixion. And to me, it feels like that. It reads like this is what set up the idea that there were two Jesuses that appeared before Pilate in the Gospel of Mark. It sounds like the way Paul is describing Jesus in certain, depending on which letter we read, it sounds like it turned into the Jesus Barabbas and Jesus Christ scenario in Mark. It wouldn't surprise me if that's the way it went. That's all I'm saying.
So what you had And the Pauline community, when they're writing their letters, there were a lot of undecided issues in early Christianity. There were
Right.
multiple Christologies. There were multiple things. And even the resurrection, whether it's spiritual or physical, you see Paul playing both sides of the fence
Right.
so that he can't be pinned down wrong one way or the other. And again, be labeled with polemic, because Paul, early on, he was hated and loved by the masses. Not everybody was a fan of Paul, and that's why
Right.
we have the later pseudepigrapha that tries to soften his view up and change the Christology and theology to a more softer palate, so to speak, as the theology evolved.
Right. Yeah, it seems like over time, this idea of some kind of a non-crucified Jesus that was created in Mark, Jesus Barabbas, which I think this double Jesus situation was created because of Paul's tap dancing, as we were just discussing. And the later Jesus Barabbas seems to have been the inspiration behind the non-crucified Jesus discussed in the later Gnostic literature or Apocrypha that was deliberately confused with the gospel Christ.
And I look at that and I just there were so many different Christologies out there, and again, not a lot was settled, but Paul had his. I'm not sure if he was an adoptive Christology like Mark was selling, or the Markan text was selling, so to speak. But the Gnostic text, most of it was so late. I don't view any part of that as it's almost out of my area of study, because I try to stay within the first 150 years of early Christianity as my specialty, and most of the Gnostic text comes later, and or the church fathers viewing Marcion as a heretic and knowing what he possibly redacted.
Oh yeah, I understand that. I'm not using, in no way, shape, or form, am I using the later sources as evidence of any kind. What I'm saying is, it looks like the early sources, it looks like the late sources created different traditions based on the earlier sources.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
because that's all they had to go on. 100%
Right.
correct, yes.
And the other thing that's interesting to me is the Ascension of Isaiah, which as far as I'm aware of, most scholars agree that's like at least the first quarter of the 2nd century CE. And what's interesting about that text to me it seems to hinder the viewpoint given by Mythicists that they try to say that the Ascension of Isaiah represents an early Pauline viewpoint, but it seems like it's twisting the Gospel's viewpoint, creating some sort of docetistic-like viewpoint, although it in a very strange way. Like, it tries to say, the Ascension of Isaiah definitely puts Jesus in a more cosmic plane, which is what the Memphisists are trying to do with Paul's letters. But the Ascension of Isaiah still says something about Jesus having human parents and being a descendant of King David. So it's still incorporating some of the human elements to Jesus.
Not only that, it also, you take people like I don't know, I'm probably saying it wrong, but like a Kyra S. and her poor hypothesis was, that it's all cosmic and all this silly nonsense. And these themes had been around in Judaism. They didn't have to go outside Judaism to develop any of this. And all of this is basically text that was heavily plagiarized as they're turning a peasant into a deity.
Yeah, all right. I'm familiar with those claims. And I also what I also don't like about her work, on top of what you said, because I have the same problems with her work as you do. She likes to use the already debunked so-called parallels between Horus and Jesus that was discussed by Gerald Massey back in the 19th century CE, and I was like, some people try to say that Jesus is some sort of Judaized, euhemerized Horus, and some even try to say, oh, Set sounds like Satan, which doesn't make any sense at all because Satan comes from the Old Testament, which is totally unrelated to Set to begin with, Hasatan, the adversary, and it's just mind-boggling to me.
How they can connect those dots, it amazes me. And none of them ever realize the importance that Herod's Temple played in setting up Christianity to begin with. And I will say that because most people don't realize that there were, on average, almost 500,000 people making these pilgrimage to Jerusalem for the Passover. So you had in 37 acres of that temple complex and the surrounding city, you had 400,000 people on average. They built that temple to turn it into a pay-for-play Hellenistic Judaism. Basically, it opened up monotheism to the whole Roman Empire, and you had people making all these trips in, and a lot of them found value in the monotheism. And at this time, you could after the crucifixion and after the Jesus theology started going, you had a choice. You could worship as if you were in the diaspora and you were being turned on to early Christianity. A couple weeks before, you could have been worshiping the emperor as the son of God, a corrupt politician. And then now all of a sudden, here's this one God concept instead of a polytheistic God concept, who is the true son of God. And you just had part of an adoptive sort of Christology, and you had the one God, the one whole God concept, and the monotheism, and it was basically the man who suffered and gave it all for the common man. And why Jesus was martyred, some people would like to claim that it was the resurrection, and I don't buy that, because you could have spiritual resurrection, or you could have in the New Testament, as Herod thought that John was resurrected because Jesus was teaching the same thing. So because John's message was still alive through Jesus, John was resurrected. So you had all these different contexts for what resurrection may have even started out with, whether it be spiritual, physical, both, and or the message was still alive, so he was surely resurrected. So you've got all these different things in play, and for what I see is the reason that Jesus was martyred is his perceived selfless sacrifice. That's kind of my own deal, but there it is.
Yeah. I could see that. And the other thing that annoys me is that there are, instead of Mythicists, you have people out there that are, something I've referred to as, anachronistic historicists that think Jesus lived in a different time period other than the Pilate reign, and it's like the claim that the Egyptian was Jesus in the 50s and 60s, or the other ridiculous claim that he was the claim that Jesus survived the resurrection or crucifixion and was in India. Yeah, totally absurd. I mean, you're throwing the historicity of John the Baptist. There's basically two certainties in the historical Jesus, and one that he was baptized by John, which literally means he was John's student. And you had that, and then you've got that he was crucified under the time of Pilate and Caiaphas in the temple when they ruled. And those are the only two certainties that we really know for sure, and everything else are lesser amounts of plausibility, so to speak. Yeah. And the other thing is that I've also pointed out in the past that Paul's epistles is authentic epistles. If you look at the chronology he gives in 2 Corinthians and in Galatians about the 14 years, the other 14 years, and the other 3 years, he ended up it's all 31 years. And what's amazing about it is that James was killed in 62. And by Ananias ben Ananias, the high priest, and 31 years before that death, even if it's not quite, even if it's debatable how connected that is with Galatians, it's 31 years before that death. It takes us right back to the 80-30s, and 2 Corinthians in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, when it talks about, I think it was 2 Corinthians chapter 11, excuse me. It was about Aretas, where Paul was fleeing from Aretas, because Paul was getting out of Dodge in Damascus. Aretas reigned in a parallel time to Pilate. And that's around the time Paul was having his vision. So, even though Paul doesn't mention Pilate directly, even with Paul's chronology, it still takes the historian back to the 10-year reign of Pilate.
Excellent points.
Yeah. And I think that's what anachronistic historicists don't understand. There's even this silly claim that I've been dealing with for a while. I got different people coming at me saying Paul is Josephus. And I don't even understand how that is even, how someone could even think.
To me, it's too absurd to even question.
Yeah.
I mean, Paul was a Hellenistic Jew, as to me all early Christians were. I don't see any connection to Christianity, even though they say that Paul and Peter and James had started Christianity. I don't find any connection to the Jerusalem church. We have no traditions from them. We have no text. We have nothing but what is described in Acts and the Pauline text that Paul had talked to them. But as far as what they tried to do, I think that they had zero influence on what Christianity would become. And the way that I see early Christianity actually taking place is after Jesus' crucifixion, the martyrdom developed, and when you went to Passover, all these Hellenists would, by the hundreds of thousands, would go back to the temple. They would gather with like-minded Christians, proto-Christians, so to speak, and they would share Christology. They would share sayings back and forth. That's probably the first time when we're starting to see some of the early texts develop, like the Passion narrative that went into Mark. But then once it was all over, they would go back home and share with their communities. Next year, different communities would come, sometimes the same people. And this kept going on for 30 years. And that's why Christianity was so rapidly spread the first 100 years all over the Roman Empire. It just, for me, it leaves nothing but the timeline from John the Baptist, Pilate and Caiaphas. Everything is right in line. And we know so much of the cultural and social anthropology of these time periods. There's really not much that you can sneak in. Even a 5-year window of error is pretty obvious due to the basically all the players and the evidence that we have that suggest all these people were real. Right. I mean, if you're going to throw John the Baptist out, if you're going to throw Paul out, then you can create any kind of historical past. You can create any conspiracy theory. I just call it tinfoil hat scholarship at that point. It's not credible. Yeah.
And there's even some people out there that are so desperate to prove anachronistic historicity that they would say John, Jesus, and James passages in Josephus are total forgeries in totality, and they would say that John was Theudas, and again the Jesus and the Egyptian thing. It's like just because they went to the same mountain too. It's like saying Bob went to Mount Everest in the 1930s, and then John hiked the same mountain in the 1960s. And just because they hiked on the same mountain doesn't mean they're the same person.
Correct. Yeah, there's one thing I've noticed with weak scholars that are historist and mythicist is just the parallel mania can just be obscene. And the problem is there's a lot of parallels going on, because when they were creating a deity from a Galilean peasant, they paralleled Herod to a point. I mean, that's why you've got the Herod passage. That's why you have Inri on the sign on the cross. They were trying to build a new king of the Jews to replace Herod. And not only that, they like the Sermon on the Mount or the Sermon on the Valley, whichever one you want to follow, those sayings That's another way of getting Jesus in front of large crowds like the emperor, where they were paralleling his divinity, since they were creating a new Son of God that was better than the Son of God that was lived before, or lived while Jesus was actually alive.
Right.
So there's good parallels, but you can't get crazy.
Right.
I'm a minimalist at heart, and I think once you start creating too much, you're also you're abusing the evidence. You're milking it for too much for what it actually is.
Agreed. And the other thing that these people don't understand is, it's more, in my opinion, it's more logical to assume that these other Sicarii leaders, or Messianic leaders, as some would like to call them, they could just easily have been inspirations to help them create the biography of Jesus. They could have derived the idea that some of the things that Jesus did.
Well, they definitely adopted many things. I mean, we don't know whether Jesus influenced the legend of Apollonius of Tyana, or vice versa.
Right.
Back and forth. So yeah, there's definitely a lot of influence, and definitely Christianity absorbed a lot into their tale, but they didn't get too crazy to where it diminished their deity.
Right. Yeah, because as you were saying earlier, they often take it way too far with the parallel mania. They would take one person that parallels Jesus in one specific way and assume there must be other parallels that we don't know about, which is essentially what parallel mania is. That you assume the rest of the parallels.
Well, it's important to know that the gospel authors, the way that they were trained to write, was they were trained to persuade the reader to believe what they're telling you, and they built authority in their message. They built authority in the person that they're trying to sell, and they're building authority in the author all at the same time. But they were trained to exaggerate, and to, again, the purpose of the letter wasn't to record history. These aren't accurate historical details. They wrote their stories to sell their theology to the masses, which at that time was basically in their community. But something that most schools don't teach, and you're not going to find in any scholars' books right now that I've come up with, is that the reason we even have the Gospel of Mark was due to the war. So when the war started, it changed the way all the early proto-Christians proselytized, and the way that they shared information. For the last, 37 years, 35 years, they were going to Passover, and they were sharing everything. And once the war started, they were left isolated in their communities, and they couldn't go back and share anything. So, and then it's magically that before the war is even finished, we've got a compilation known as Mark. And I kind of find that important due to the war itself.
Well, those are some very powerful points. People out there, not enough people out there understand. Even if Mark wasn't fully written at that exact time period, it was certainly because of the war that we ended up with Mark one way or the other. And you look at, what's interesting is, you look at Josephus, and you see him mentioning other Jesuses, like Jesus, son of Saphias, whom led 600 fishermen, which is interesting, fishermen from Galilee against the commander Vespasian on 67 CE. It's possibly another example of how different Messianic leaders or Sicarii leaders, in their actions and what they've done, have been conglomerated in the gospel, into the gospel Jesus. So different actions.
Absolutely. And again, I'll point out that with Josephus, you always have to take it with a grain of salt, because it's a Hellenistic lens. Yeah. And it's the same thing with the New Testament. We have a Hellenistic lens looking into an Aramaic teacher.
Yeah.
And just because of that time difference, but just because there's a time difference, and just because it's cross-cultural oral and written traditions, doesn't mean that it's fictional or 100% mythical. The people are said to have have been there, and there's no reason to question. Again, once you start throwing the baby out with the bathwater, you can create anything, and that's not the kind of history that I'd like to believe in.
Agreed. Yeah, and I think people typically they just don't understand that. Like when I talk to there's some hardcore Memphisists on that I've talked with, and some of them are like so hardcore that they don't even believe in a historical Paul. It's not even.
I know most of them by name. I've been with them. I've been in all the Mythicist forums, and that's where I've kind of honed my skills. And what you're going to find is most of those people that are at that point have not studied any of the anthropology, cultural or social.
Right.
And you're going to see that they're just they won't even study the topic that they're interested in, and they're just basically parroting their favorite mythicist, who tends to be either Price, who is really almost agnostic if you read the fine details on Price, but you're sort of getting, I mean, the carrier rights, so to speak, are probably the stereotypical worst at having the least education. But again, that's what Carrier aimed his book at. His book was not aimed at scholars or academia in any way. It was aimed at the rather large atheist audience.
Yeah, when I looked at when I looked at his books on the Historicity of Jesus, I looked at the covers, book covers, because typically if a book was directly addressing scholarship, it would discuss it immediately in the book covers, and I didn't notice it too much, even though there are parts on the Historicity of Jesus he claims that he is actually challenging scholarship. You can tell for the majority of the book he's basically trying to say that how should I put it? He's trying to say any extra biblical reference to Jesus regarding Josephus or Tacitus is a forgery, total forgery, and after he builds that in his reader's mind, he then says, okay, all we have is Paul's letters. And then Paul's letters has some sort of manufactured angelic Jesus born out of some sort of space seed of David, which doesn't make any sense to me at all. And really, that's all I can say, because I'm even having a hard time explaining it. It's just...
Well, the cosmic Jesus theory is dead. It's been dead for a long time. I used to try to fight the mythicist online and argue with them, but you couldn't. It's just like debating a young earth creationist. You're not going to change their mind. They're going to go on thinking. You're not going to get into their head. And the only reason I did it in text, in line, on the forums that I was involved with, was so that people who were actually curious, who were reading through, could make up their mind from educated sources as opposed to non-educated sources. There's so much that we know that it's hard for me to even digest or even explain. I think one of the best papers that I've ever read on this comes out of Princeton, and it's the historical Jesus in context, and it's Crossan, Levine, and 15 or 20 other of all the major scholars that you can think of have all contributed to their specialty. So you've got everybody giving a chirp in, but it's anthropology based more so than their own personal feelings. And so once you realize how the political situation evolved, you see clearly that stuff like this could happen and people like this could be martyred, and there's nothing out of place in the historical Jesus that even questions the way that this all went down. It's completely in line with all of the social anthropology and how these people acted, lived, and behaved. Paul wasn't selling any weird stuff. He was just basically arguing circumcision to the different ways that he had heard arguments that were already ongoing with communities that we only have one side of this. It would be so great if we could have the other community's response or what they had responded that Paul was responding to. It would clear a lot of this up, and then they'd have absolutely nothing to run on.
Very true. And the one great thing that really convinced me that the Memphis position isn't very tenable is the fact that Paul describes his Jesus as being crucified. Even if in some weird way he's trying to spiritualize it, in the end, there is no example of an angel or a god before Christianity that's being crucified by demons in outer space. And it really shows that in the end, no matter how much Paul tap dances around the martyrdom of Jesus, he must have been describing a historically crucified Jesus.
You know what? I think the best evidence, which really isn't textual, that I started out as a mythicist with no education, and as I started arguing and trying to convince people, I decided to get educated. As I got educated, I started learning more and more. But in the beginning of my education, what switched me over to a historist was basically, it was put to me, and I agreed, and I thought about it one night, and I said, there's really no other, you really can't argue it. And that's that, why would the Romans be turning one of their slaves into a god? It makes no sense. Jews weren't they were just viewed as stubborn. So it's not like the Jewish slave would be put on a pedestal in Roman culture. It's unfathomable to think of unless they actually believe that he was their god. And that they did, and they argued and believed in it. And that's the whole thing about all the Pauline texts and the Gospels, is these weren't they weren't governments trying to change people's mind. These were people like you and me literally writing their thoughts down, trying to change the minds of other people. And what they were trying to change them to wasn't something out of place for their time period. It was exactly in line. There's to me, there's nothing fishy or to me, I find it unfathomable that people are even still mythicists, but I just look at it as uneducated atheists that lack the education to understand how much we actually know about this time period, because we've got quite a few of these details. It's amazing how much we know, and you wouldn't guess it by getting in these blogs or even how we're speaking here tonight.
I see. Yeah, I do think, like you were saying earlier, at least from a minimalist point of view, we know enough about Jesus to say somebody called Jesus was crucified during the 10-year reign of Pilate from 26 to 36 CE. Whatever Paul was doing with Jesus, even if he was, as I've suggested before, even if he was conflating the very identity of Jesus with a Hellenistic client king of some kind, as I suggested in the past, regardless, in the end, it comes back to that one specific crucified Jesus during Pilate's 10-year reign. And Paul is manipulating the story. He's acting like a pastor in a sense. He's got something to sell, and he's spreading.
He's selling his community's version of that theology. Yeah. And what people don't realize, the only reason we have Paul's text today is because it became the popular version in the long run. In other words, he would be viewed as Gnostic text today, and everybody would be following Gnosticism.
Yeah, it became canon. Yeah. For
me, the other historical aspect to me is John the Baptist. And when you go, he was the popular teacher. People don't realize Jesus wasn't the popular one. The masses think Jesus was popular, and John was just another guy who baptized him. But John was the popular one. Jesus was his student. And it's funny that when Jesus ministry is also very close to when we see John's arrest and John's murder. So as far as I'm concerned, Jesus took and was trying to keep John's movement alive. He took it in his own direction, but he was definitely furthering what John had taught him.
Oh, yeah.
And I've actually had conversations with the Jesus Seminar, and we were talking, and I point blank asked them as a group, can we tell, is there anyone that can tell if a single parable in the whole New Testament originated from John or Jesus? And their answer was, no, we can't. So it's very possible that a lot of the parables that you're reading were parables that John originated. But again, when we say that, they may have originated with John, but John picked them up from local Galilean lore. So where did the Hellenists pick up all these sayings that are attributed to Jesus, like in Thomas and in Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John? People were going to these Passovers, these Hellenists, and they were sharing ideas. And all we can do basically at this point as a minimalist is hope that some of these sayings actually went back to the historical Jesus. I don't like to say any one particular one actually makes it all the way back to him. I would say some of them were actually Galilean in nature, but I wish we had more evidence so that we could actually attribute more of this to the actual man himself. But until we get the more evidence, and it's not likely to come up anytime soon without any huge discovery, but it would sure be nice.
Yeah, those are some very powerful points. All right, I think we can end it there. I think that would be a good ending. What do you think?
Awesome, man. Appreciate your time, Jacob.
Oh, thank you. It's my pleasure. I appreciate you coming on. All right, everyone. Thank you for watching, and please subscribe to this channel if any of you already haven't. If any of you haven't subscribed, please subscribe. Unless you already are, thank you. And if any of you wish to consider supporting this channel any further than that, check out PayPal, Patreon, or Super Chat and a YouTube live video in the future. Thank you for watching. Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.